Hi everyone, this is Peter Beal, back with our discussion of Sandro Botticelli, very famous 15th century, sort of later 15th century Florentine painter. And we're going to talk a little bit about how his art differs substantially from a number of the important developments that occur in the Italian peninsula after about 1420 or 30, thereabouts. We discussed last time a little bit to do with the painting Primavera. So that's going to be that was the focus basically of the first discussion. And we discussed how this, for example, tended to ignore the ideas, rules, modes of visual representation that favored a close attention to naturalism, the behavior of light, representation of the human body, and all the rest of it. Also the ways in which this painting tended to ignore the typical tendency of artists such as Masaccio and sculptors such as Nanni di Banco to engage in themes that were more public, more civic, typically Christian in terms of their at least overt source material. So the Primavera tends not to subscribe to any of these norms, instead favoring a poetic, allusive kind of art that favors much more esoteric, arcane subject matter presented in a fashion that's calculated, I think, to interest those in an elite and relatively closed, courtly, aristocratic, and possibly intellectual circle. And this, of course, is probably not entirely surprising, owing to the rise in Florence at the time of the Medici family and the efforts on the part of Cosimo de' Medici, who dies in 1464, to patronize cultural endeavors, in particular interest, besides the straightforward enough patronage of architects and sculptors and the rest, was also his effort to provide a sort of base for the study, especially of the philosopher Plato, hence the emergence of the Platonic Academy. The name makes it pretty clear what one of the most important focuses of that would have been. If we think about the importance of Plato in Western culture, we could spend a great deal of time doing that indeed. And this is not the place to go into any kind of depth. I have another video out on YouTube on the topic of Renaissance humanism, more broadly speaking, talking a little bit about the emergence of Plato and Platonism, and obviously Neoplatonism as well. And I think that might be helpful as background for thinking maybe in a little bit more detail about the likes of Botticelli. But I'll then sort of discuss in broad terms why Plato and why Platonism might be particularly helpful in thinking about the work of Sandro Botticelli, and again, thinking more specifically about some of the personalities that are involved in the creation of this art. Let's begin, though, right away by looking at, especially thinking about our previous discussion of the Primavera, looking at how Botticelli's painting is, in essence, in much the same kind of general vein as the Primavera, the Birth of Venus. It's dated typically to roughly the same period. There doesn't appear to be as clear a kind of understanding of the likely patronage of the painting in comparison to the Primavera. The Primavera seems to have a more specific link to a 1482 wedding of a member of the Medici family, and the specifics on that we probably don't need to go into in this talk, but suffice to say there's a little bit more consensus about the circumstances of the patronage of Primavera. The Birth of Venus not so clear, and one could equally argue perhaps its message is at least as enigmatic and ambiguous, I guess, as that of the Primavera, perhaps even more so. Botticelli presents us with a scene that is from the very beginning. I think it's easy to see how this could be kind of interpreted in a heraldic mode. Heraldic presentation is a very kind of schematic, oftentimes sort of outline or profile type of juxtaposition, oftentimes of, anomalous or unlikely characters. And that's certainly what we see here. In the center of the picture, and we really can't miss her, is a representation of a nude woman covering her pubic area with extraordinarily lengthy golden hair and somewhat ineffectually covering her breasts with her right hand. She doesn't seem to be engaging with either of the two figures to her right or the figure to her left, or indeed at all with the spectator. Her nudity, especially in a painting on this scale at this time, is pretty much unprecedented. There isn't really a comparable piece that we can see in Italy at the time, or pretty much anywhere in Europe. The only type of representation of a nude woman on this kind of size or prominence would be Eve, and this is clearly not an Eve figure by any stretch of the imagination. As just mentioned before, we see two figures to her right that may very well be a kind of revision of Zephyr and Chloris, and you can see the flowers being strewn, roses. Those are emblems of Venus here. I think they're roses. And then to her right, a more enigmatic character, a woman clad in this beautiful garment here, dress bedecked with flowers, rushes forward with some sort of cape or mantle that clearly is intended to envelop Venus. That is to say, her nudity, as she's seen here in the picture, is going to be a transient phenomenon, that she's not going to stay nude for much longer, or depending on how you want to look at it, naked. That is to say, her physicality will not be on display for too much longer. It's really not entirely clear who the person represented on the right actually is. There are different interpretations, and I think for our purposes in this introductory kind of material for the Birth of Venus, we don't probably need to fret too long about the specific identity other than to think about what she's doing, what her function is in the scene. To the far right is a small grove, what appears to be laurel trees. And the laurel, especially in classical mythology, is a particularly fertile ground for interpretation. I think we can set that to one side for now and focus on other aspects. The setting of the scene is what appears to be the ocean. And this is not a common setting in Botticelli's work, and he doesn't seem particularly concerned with any kind of plausible naturalism or realism regarding the representation of the ocean. We can see waves are suggested in this kind of visual shorthand of these little white kind of V shapes that seem to move towards shore. You can see that there's a rather large cockle shell right here, which has its own symbolic possibilities. And there's some sort of movement of water as this object moves towards shore. There's absolutely no coherent attempt to present the viewer with a naturalistic rendering of the seashore or atmospheric perspective, or just about anything that would orient the viewer to a plausible natural setting. The shell itself and the figure which is standing on it seem to have no plausible kind of relationship in terms of weight or mass or gravity. She simply is hovering in a kind of interesting and not, again, anatomically plausible stance. You can see her left foot doesn't, that ankle is not going to pass muster in a basic anatomy class. And I mean, obviously that's not entirely the point. That Botticelli is giving us a kind of representation of an idealized female physique more than anything else. There are a number of other sort of archaicisms in this. One of them would be the ample use of these little gold stippling elements to suggest light. It's really hard to kind of tell. Is there some other, kind of way of signifying the sort of hieratic or sacred or mythological aspect of this? It's hard to say, but Botticelli liberally laces the painting with these golden highlights. You can see in the laurel trees along the base right here, and so on. The painting, in terms of its representations of light, along with the gold stippling, is certainly reminiscent of the Primavera in the sense that the light source, which is coming just sort of generically from the upper right and raking across the scene, doesn't really seem to conform to a sort of plausible, believable optical experience that we might experience in the sort of mundane, regular, three-dimensional, world that we live in. Instead, the light is a kind of representational light more than anything else. It serves to show, again, the modeling of the Venus figure, show contours, give some sense of three-dimensional mass, but it's certainly not intended to be particularly convincing, let alone illusionistic. As I've already mentioned, the presentation of the figures in a kind of typical Botticelli mode, they're elongated to the point of possibly, you could argue, distortion, a sense of unreality, and again, a lack of plausible, natural human anatomy dominates. Well, what's the point of all of this sort of mythologizing representation of whatever theme this is in a kind of dreamy and somewhat unreal way? Well, the typical read that many, many students of the painting will propose, and I think it's a plausible one to begin thinking about the painting with, is a kind of, again, allegorical mode. Allegory meaning the figures stand here for something else, as a kind of representation of the Platonic concept of love and beauty as reaching toward a kind of higher understanding, essentially an ultimate understanding of the good. This is probably most convincingly developed in Plato's dialogues in the Symposium, where there's a long discussion of a kind of ascendancy toward the good through the contemplation of beautiful forms. Perhaps that's what's going on here. And this is a kind of idea that is developed to a certain extent by one of the most important figures in this interest in Florence and the works of Plato, the sort of master, as it were, of the Platonic Academy. It's Marsilio Ficino, who develops this to a pretty considerable extent, this concept. It's a concept that certainly has a long, long afterlife from the time of Plato, who's working in the 5th into the 4th century BCE in Greece. That by understanding the beauty, as I think he sees it, inherent in beautiful things, it could be people, it could be works of art, words, concepts, whatever, that we begin to catch some glimpse of the true and higher beauty that ultimately culminates in the good. It's a way of thinking that sort of works pretty well, actually. We can see somebody like Augustine adapting this for Christian purposes. But as we come into the middle, late 15th century in the Medici court, it's pretty clear that this allegorical reading was seen as having virtue in its own right and for its own sake. And particularly if we took the visual language of, say, ancient Greece or Rome and adopted, for instance, the famous Venus. This is the Venus de Medici. It sort of comes after Botticelli's Venus. Or other famous works, we would indeed have a very interesting and compelling visual image indeed.